So let me go now into our morning plenary. As I mentioned before, this started. We started work on this last year at the Portland conference, where we invited advocates from across the country to talk about juvenile justice reform, particularly with young people that have been charged with violent crimes. The way that we got into this was my friend Marc Schindler, who I've known for about 25 years. He is the director of the Justice Policy Institute. 25 years ago, I did not like him. I was a prosecutor and he was a defense attorney, and we swore to hate each other forever. Well, 25 years later, we've seen each other through tons of ups and downs, and we've gone to each other's weddings and our kids play together. So hopefully here you will find prosecutors and defense attorneys getting together and becoming best friends. One of the reasons that we became best friends was our love for young people. So when Mark came to me about a year and a half ago and said the Annie E. Casey Foundation is very interested in looking at how we can better serve young people who have been charged with violent crimes. I said I'm particularly interested in that issue because I know how many of those young people have been victims themselves. They have been beat, they have been sexually assaulted, they have been tortured, and oftentimes that is the root of their behavior. But I said, look, I can't go on my opinion. We need the opinions of those from across the nation. And that's when we put together the roundtable. We took all the suggestions that came out of there, and the Justice Policy Institute and the National Center came together to create a report, thanks to the Annie E. Casey Foundation, called Smart, Safe, and Fair Strategies to Prevent Youth Violence. The executive summary is on your app. I suggest that it's a good read. It'll give you a lot of insights. So one of the things, as I said, was one of the reasons I wanted to look at this was because I knew I had worked for about 13 years with young people who had been both victims and offenders, and I knew much of their background. But what the roundtable said that, well, they cautioned us, and I think all of you will understand this, that we cannot talk for all victims. One person, one group should never talk about for all victims, because all victims want different things. But there was some consensus that came out of the roundtable. They said that the juvenile justice system should serve youth effectively, they should be held accountable, and that victims' needs should be met. The other thing that they said was they wanted a system that could rehabilitate youth. And if that could be done in a community setting while keeping victims safe, that was also something that we should be doing more of. So I'd like to invite our first panelist up to the stage. I want to start by thanking the Annie E. Casey Foundation and all that they've done for us. We're very honored to have Patrick McCarthy here. He is the president of the foundation. He has also run a juvenile justice facility. Please come up. We have Marc Schindler, and in addition to being a defense attorney and the current executive director of the Justice Policy Institute, he has also run a juvenile justice facility. We have Ann Seymour, which to many of you is a household name. She has been in the victims world since we started talking about victims as a nation. So we're very happy to have her here. And we have Aswad Thomas, also a well-known victim advocate that has spoken with us before and can really help us sort of understand this issue and understand the possibilities that we could have to make victims safer and to maybe also change around the lives of young people. With that, I'd like to turn it over to Marc Schindler. Marc.
Good morning. How's everybody out there? Thank you so much to Mai Fernandez for that very nice introduction. So I actually didn't hate Mai when I first met her. I thought she was kind of cool, but maybe I don't know, I felt like there was a person there, and for folks who know Mai, who deeply cared about young people. We may have come at it from different angles in the justice system, but I knew it was somebody that I could work with, and as Mai said, we've been through a lot over the last 25 years, and I'm glad to see our kids are now spending time, and you know, what we care about and what we work on often mesh, and that's what we're here to talk about this morning. So again, it's my pleasure, and I'm going to use this to advance this. I'm thrilled to be here today. This is my second NCVC conference. Last year was amazing, and I know this year is going to be equally excellent. And just to be in a room with folks like you who do the work day in and day out, who bring your perspectives to the table, for us at the Justice Policy Institute is a treasure, because we deeply believe that we should be responding and providing information to the field, and that was our motivation to work with NCVC on this really critical report. So I want to thank all of you for being here, and thank Mai and all the work that's going on. I also want to thank the Annie E. Casey Foundation, particularly Patrick McCarthy, who's here, who's going to share some comments in just a few minutes, for their leadership in the field. For folks who are not familiar with Annie E. Casey, which I think probably is hardly anyone, they are the voice for young people and well-being in the child welfare system, in the juvenile justice system, and throughout our public systems. They are the leader both in advocating and supporting organizations who are doing this important work. And again, I want to thank all of you for being here this morning as we, and I'm very excited to say, announce the release of our report this morning that is jointly being released with the National Center for Victims of Crime. You have it on your app, actually the full report as well as the executive summary. And this is going live on Facebook. And we're getting lots of interest around the field. So this is essentially a big press conference right now where we're going to talk about the report and the findings. So I'm going to jump in and talk a little bit about some of the key findings that we heard, including from this community. As Mai said, this was a collaborative effort between JPI and NCVC. We at JPI are researchers with expertise in criminal and juvenile justice expertise in the field, and we pulled the research together about what we believe is an incredibly serious issue, right? I'm not sure we could talk about a more serious issue than young people who are involved in violent behavior, both in terms of hurting people, but also, as we know and as Mai talked about, who have also been victimized themselves. We take this work very seriously. And we take the issue of whether we can serve young people involved in violent behavior in the community very seriously. We are not dismissive at all of the fact that people have been hurt oftentimes, but I think we share the goals as a community about what we can do to have safer communities, healthier communities, and fewer victims in the long run. So I think we share those goals. So I'm going to start off and see if it comes back up. And before I jump into my presentation, I'm going to note how many folks are tweeting, Twitter, doing that this morning. See some hands up. So the hashtag is SmartSafeFair. I've already forgotten the hashtag for the conference, but I think you all know it. So feel free to share that as we get into the information. So a little context first, right? Just to set the context. Why are we focused on this? So there's good news in juvenile justice, and that is over the last 20 years or so, there's been a very significant decline in the confined population, particularly over the last 10 to 12 years. A more than 50% decline since 1995 of young people who were incarcerated. And as you'll see from this chart, at the same time, there was a very steep decline in the number of young people who were charged, right? So juvenile crime has gone down at the same time as youth incarceration has gone down, and that's very significant and good news. It shows for policymakers that we can reduce the number of young people who are locked up while not compromising public safety, right? Now, most of this decline, about 70%, were for youth involved in nonviolent offenses, right? And I think we can all agree that youth involved in nonviolent offenses shouldn't be incarcerated. And so maybe, should that be the end of the conversation, that we're reducing the use of incarceration for kids who are involved in nonviolent crime? Crime is going down. Maybe that's it. But we wanted to look a little bit more closely at what the research says about this and see if we can keep pushing and be smarter on crime. Right? So a couple of things in terms of incarceration, right, which is, as we know, overused in this country. And we wanted to take a look and see what do we know about the use of incarceration, particularly for kids, right? One is, it is extraordinarily expensive, right? So we did a report back in 2015 at JPI, looked at the cost of incarceration around the country, and what we saw was that on average, states spend about $150,000 a year to incarcerate a young person. Think about that, $150,000 a year on average, and you have some of the states listed up there, some even higher. California spending over $300,000 a year, Ohio almost $200,000, and right here in Florida almost $100,000. How many folks have kids in college, near college, thinking about college, right? Think about, we think college is expensive, and it is. This is like twice or 3 times that. So I think the question is, can we do better? Can we spend our resources more wisely? And I would suggest that if you talk to a businessman about this, right, they would say, I think we can do better. I'm not sure that that's the wisest investment, right? But they would say, does it work, right? The fact is, it doesn't work to make us safer, despite the high price tag, right? Despite that high price tag, we see extraordinarily high rates of recidivism of young people coming out to these institutions, out of these facilities, and committing more crimes, right? We need to do better and think about how we're spending our resources, right? And again, with the return on investment that we're getting, we should be able to figure out a better way to spend our resources. Another important question is it fair, right? So over the last several years, particularly, there's been lots of discussion about racial implications in our justice system, right? Everything from police shootings, from young black men who are being killed by officers, to the violence that we see on a regular basis, and the disproportionate number of black and brown people filling up our prisons. This is a chart, a little bit hard to see, but basically what we see here is that even for similar types of behavior, even for similar offenses, black and brown young people end up incarcerated, end up treated more harshly for the same types of behavior. The same types of behavior. So we're talking about basic fairness. Right? Is there a better way? Because now what we've said, what we see now, is that it's not effective, or the most effective way we can get to public safety. It costs an extraordinary amount of money, and it's not fair. So it's incumbent upon us, I think, to think about how can we spend taxpayer dollars more wisely to benefit communities, right? There's actually a growing amount of experience out there that shows that we can do better than incarceration. So I had the privilege of being in the leadership and helping to run the district's Department of Juvenile Corrections for a number of years. And in that experience, we downsized significantly, right? So we went from 250 kids locked up in an old, dangerous facility, and as of 2 weeks ago, there were only 20 kids in DC who were locked up in a new, smaller facility that actually looks like a community college campus. Juvenile crime in the district continues to go down. One of the things we looked at, we first saw that there were many more nonviolent kids locked up, right? But what about the kids who were involved in violent behavior? And we started to look at the research at that time, and have since over the years, and what we saw is 2 things, and you can find this in more detail in the report, is that the nature of the offense, whether it's violent or not violent, means almost nothing in terms of future likelihood of reoffending, right? So somebody involved in a violent offense versus someone who's involved in a non-violent offense doesn't necessarily tell you much about what they'll do in the future, right? So there's a researcher named Mulvey who looked at this very closely, and he saw that it's basically awash in terms of what that tells you, right? We had another researcher, Ed Latessa in Ohio, who looked at 10,000 young people over a period of time in Ohio and compared how they did based on whether they were in a facility versus in the community coming out, right? And what it showed actually is that for all risk levels, low, medium, high, kids who were in the community did better in the long run, right? And we know that incarceration has many costs monetarily, but also it separates kids from school, from families, from their communities, and makes it less likely that they'll do well in the long run. And the research is now bearing this out. We're also seeing, and I can't go into detail on this, but you'll hear more about this, I think, from the panel, is that there's increasingly, we know, better ways to work with young people and with victims of crime, right? Restorative justice, which I think a lot of you know about. So, for example, in California, we saw that compared to 37% of California youth being reconvicted after 3 years, those who went through a restorative justice approach was half that, right? Half as likely to be reconvicted. And that victims are more satisfied when we talk with them, when their survey's done, after a restorative justice approach than just sending someone to be locked up. Fully 93% of victims of youth crime were satisfied with the level of accountability through restorative justice compared to regular criminal justice reforms where it's much lower. So we know that we can do better. We thought it was equally important, and Mai talked about this, to hear when we're talking about young people involved in violent crime, particularly, what does this community think? We know what the research says, right? But in real day-to-day experiences, what does it mean for somebody who's been impacted directly, either them or a family member who's been hurt? What does it mean to them? And so we brought folks from this community together a year ago. We've looked at polling over the last several years to say, what does the victims community think? And what we saw, as Mai said, that the approach is pretty straightforward. It needs to meet the needs of young people, strengthen families, and address those underlying causes of crime. We heard a couple of things very strongly out of the roundtable. One is that there should be no categorical bar on serving young people in the community who have committed a violent crime. Doesn't mean that a young person who committed a violent crime should never be locked up. Doesn't mean that. And we recognize, and what we heard is there are some young people who are at such high risk that they need to be removed from the community for some period of time. But they said we should look beyond just what they're charged with. Let's look at their risks, let's look at their needs, right? And what we heard is that the community approach can hold a young person just as accountable, and I would argue even more accountable than confinement. What happens when a young person is confined? They're sent away from their community. There's no interaction with the victims, with the rest of their community. When they're home, if it's done well, they have to deal with this. They have to learn from this, right? If your child does something, you don't just send them away and not talk to them about it, right? That's a learning experience, and if done well, that can be incredibly helpful in making it less likely they'll do harm in the future. And also, as Mai said, recognizing that young people who are involved in violent crime are themselves overwhelmingly victims. Think about that. Overwhelmingly victims. We know hurt people hurt people. I don't have to say that in this audience. If we don't deal with that pain, with that trauma, what's going to happen in the future, right? We know what's going to happen. And lastly, as Mai said, and we want to be very clear about this, just like there's no one way, no monolithic view to treat a young person on what they need, there's no monolithic view from the victims community, right? We heard that there are a range of views, but what we heard, and I think what you'll hear from some of the speakers as well, is that increasingly the victim and crime survivor community is speaking out and saying, we're not wanting long sentences and punishment the way it's portrayed oftentimes in the media, and maybe by politicians. It's much more nuanced than that. And when people have a choice between rehabilitation and incarceration, they overwhelmingly choose rehabilitation. So that was important in terms of what we heard. Okay, quickly, a path forward, right? Our recommendations were informed by the research as well as the input from this community. And we had a couple of things that we wanted to talk about. One is, what we heard loud and clear is, if you're going to put a young person in the community, it has to be in an approach and a program that's effective, and that is effectively resourced, right? Because we know in a number of places, including California, Ohio, and Virginia, while there has been shifts in moving more young people into the community, including those involved in violent crime, it's not always the case that the funding follows them, right? And so, as we all know, community-based programs are often the first to be cut. You rarely see cuts in budgets to facilities, right? But we have to make sure that the programs, that the resources in the community are adequately funded. So that was really important, right? This is a big one, and I want to applaud the Casey Foundation for leading the way on this, and that is transforming the way we do probation with young people in the community. Most young people end up on probation, the overwhelming number, right? But historically, probation didn't do a very good job, and so the Annie E. Casey Foundation, they released a vision. I commend you to their website. We also have it linked on our website for transforming probation, which again serves the majority of young people, right? So a couple of things: reduce caseloads, develop individualized plans, and appropriately connect youth with community-based resources. And let's incentivize and reward good behavior as opposed to just penalizing bad behavior. I think we all know this from working with our own kids, right? We also know that many kids on probation who are served and can be served well are involved in violent behavior, right? So it's a misnomer to think that all young people who are involved in violent behavior are locked up. In fact, about 30% of the population on juvenile probation nationally have been there for a violent offense, right? And so we can work with young people in the community. Eliminating mandatory sentences, which exist in juvenile justice as they do in the adult system. And I want to quickly describe what's going on in Ohio, because I think it's really illustrative. So Ohio has significantly downsized their incarcerated youth population over the last 10 years. They went from 2,600 in 1992 to 500 in 2018, and they closed most of their large facilities. They went from 11 to 3, right? But in Ohio, there's a law that requires a 1-year youth prison stay for possession of a handgun, possession of a firearm, right? And literally 50% of the kids that are still locked up in those 3 large facilities are there because of what's referred to as the gun spec law. They had a firearm, right? A 1-year mandatory sentence. But in looking at those kids, half of those kids were low or moderate risk, right? Half were low or moderate risk, which means we're spending an extraordinary amount of money in a facility that doesn't work very well on kids who are low or moderate risk, right? These aren't necessarily kids who used a gun, they just had a gun, right? Some used and some are very high-risk kids, and those kids, we understand, may need to be away from the community for some period of time. But what about those low and moderate risk kids, right? Politicians in Ohio have shared the research on this, but they've said, we're not going to touch it politically, right? I don't think they've heard from this community, quite frankly, to say, what would work better with these young people? So that's an example of laws that we need to change. And finally, and I want to end soon so we can go to the panel, loud and clear, what we heard from the roundtable last year is we have to recognize that the young people in the system come to the system having been oftentimes traumatized and victimized. And so we start to talk about adverse childhood experiences, or ACEs. How many people are familiar with the term ACEs? All right. If you ask that question in a conference, at a juvenile justice conference, you wouldn't get hardly any folks raising their hand, right? We need to do better in our community to understand what that means, right? Because as you know, ACEs can include both physical and psychological abuse of all types, including witnessing violence, parental separation, including as a result of incarceration. And they can lead to a variety of negative outcomes, including risk of criminal justice involvement and chronic health conditions, right? So there was a study that was done here in Florida, probably the most comprehensive study on this, in 2006, looked at all the young people in Florida's juvenile justice system. How many times have you seen a data point where it says 100%? 100% of anything, right? Almost never. In this study, 98% of the kids in Florida's juvenile justice system had 4 or more adverse childhood experiences. 98%. And then the other 2% had between 1 and 3. 100% of the kids in Florida's juvenile justice system had adverse childhood experiences. If we're not doing something with that information, shame on us to understand what those young people are bringing to the table and what they're dealing with. And so our very strong recommendation, one of the recommendations in this report, is that all risk assessments going forward of kids in the juvenile justice system ask the question about adverse childhood experiences. We need to know that. We need to be able to respond. And what we know is that putting a young person in a correctional facility is in itself traumatizing, right? We're re-traumatizing young people who have been victimized. And we shouldn't do that if there's a better way. I want to close there. I want to thank everyone for your attention this morning. I really look forward to the discussion. And now it's my great honor and privilege to be able to introduce Patrick McCarthy of the Annie E. Casey Foundation. Patrick is the president and chief executive of the Annie E. Casey Foundation, and throughout his career, and you can see his bio in your packet, the lengthy and impressive bio, he's focused on reforming public systems that serve families facing significant barriers, including having closed youth prisons himself, created economically inclusive family-supporting communities. Before joining the Casey Foundation, Patrick was a public official in Delaware in both the mental health, child welfare, and juvenile justice agencies. So he comes to this issue knowing exactly what it takes to change policy and practice, and he's seen it up close. But he also knows this from a personal matter. And Patrick, who grew up himself in a low-income family in a close-knit community, he has said he understands the importance of strong and supportive family no matter what the challenges, particularly income challenges, are. And a key influence that he's talked about in his career is when he led the state juvenile correction system in Delaware, where he witnessed, and I think you'll hear more about this, the limits of the system, and in some cases the harm it did to young people. And finally, and this is something that I think is for all of us to take to heart, Patrick, who's the father of 4, says he comes to the value of the My Family test, and he encouraged us to use that. And he said, if I think of something would be bad for my own kids, why would I want it for somebody else's? And I think those are words to guide all the work that we do. If you haven't seen it, I commend you to watch Patrick's TED Talk. So Google Patrick McCarthy TED Talk, and you'll see an amazing presentation. And I think you're going to get a glimpse of that today. So with that, I want to welcome Patrick McCarthy, and again, thank you for your attention.
Good morning, everyone. When I did have the responsibility for a juvenile correction system in a state, I used to go over to the facility, the youth correctional institution where we had young people incarcerated, and I would walk around, talk to staff, talk to the young people, and over time, when I would leave that facility, I would have this heaviness in my heart because I believed that what we were doing day in and day out was just not working. It wasn't working for communities, to make communities safer. It wasn't working for the young people to get them back on track towards success. And I became convinced that it is almost impossible to operate one of these institutions in a way that is humane, fair, and equitable. So over the last 25 years, the Casey Foundation has worked in the juvenile justice field, primarily in detention, pre-trial detention. And we are increasingly working in the area of the deep end, that is incarceration as well as on probation. We have become convinced that these institutions, which really need to be called for what they are, they're not youth rehabilitative facilities or training schools, they are prisons for young people, prisons for kids. These institutions are factories of failure. 50, 60, 70, 80% recidivism rates will tell you that. The terrible long-range outcomes for young people in terms of education, employment, and their own future behavior. They are designed almost as if you set out to design something that would make it more likely that a young person would go out and reoffend. You would build one of these institutions. They ignore everything we know about youth development, ignore everything we know about brain science. We put young people in these institutions with other young people, and then we create conditions where terribly intense peer relationships are formed with other young people who have harmed people. We tell them in 100 different ways, day in and day out, that they are simultaneously worthless and dangerous, and that they have no future. And then we release them back into the community with very little supervision or support. You can look at the numbers, but I assure you, if you walk through one of these institutions, one of the things that will strike you first is the huge disparities. That is, the huge proportion of young people who are black and brown in these institutions compared to the population as a whole. In short, we do everything wrong so that we greatly increase the odds that these young people will go out into the world and potentially cause more harm. And that's why this report that Marc just described is so important. It shines a light on what we are doing wrong. It shines a light on these factories of failure. It honestly confronts the simple fact that what we are now doing is not working. It is not working for victims of crime. It is not working for communities. It is not working for the young people who are incarcerated. As important, if not more important, it offers alternatives. It offers common sense and evidence-based examples of approaches that can work more effectively. Now, we know, as Marc said, that it is critical to hold young people accountable for their behavior. It was critical for all of us as we grew up. It's critical for our children. It's critical for these young people who have harmed someone. But what does that really mean, to hold someone accountable? Is it simply to punish them? Is that the same as holding them accountable? Or can we hold them accountable by ensuring that they acknowledge and take responsibility for the harm that they've done without minimizing and without making excuses for it, and that they take action to do everything they can to restore the harm that they've done to the victim, and that they take action with support to ensure that it never happens again? Isn't that really what true accountability is? And do these institutions provide that? If you have a 70% recidivism rate, I can assure you we do not. We know that some young people will need some period of time where they will need to be confined. We are not saying that no young person ought to be confined in a secure facility. But if you need to confine a young person, we should use the time that that young person is confined to put them back on track. And they're not in these large adult-type prisons that we currently rely much too much on. We are increasingly seeing around the country the development of smaller, community-based institutions, facilities, including those that are secure, that put the young person back on track by providing education and support, dealing with the trauma, and holding them accountable in real ways. Finally, I think it's really important to note that this report lifts up the voices of those who have been victims of crimes of this community. I believe it's critical that the juvenile corrections field hears from victims of crime as to what victims of crime would like to see happen in a reshaped, redesigned, more effective juvenile justice system. At the same time, we are working very hard to listen more carefully to the families of young people who have been incarcerated and to the young people themselves. I think there's an opportunity here for dialogue from all of these voices coming together to advocate for a more effective juvenile justice system. Thank you.
So we're going to go into the question and answer period. First, Aswad and Ann, can you give us the very quick elevator speech as to how you got to this work?
Wow. I'll give you a quick history. Back in 1986, the American Correctional Association actually wrote a report on victims involved in the juvenile justice system because we thought we were more focused on the criminal justice system. And over the years, I did a lot of work in restorative justice, and more recently, in the past decade, I think I've been in 5 or 6 states working on juvenile justice reinvestment that engages crime victims and survivors.
Aswad?
For me, I think it's been all my life experiences from the age of 10 years old when my best friend was killed in a drive-by shooting in Detroit, Michigan, and also, with my family being impacted by incarceration and violence. 5 out of the 10 males in my family are victims of gun violence. 7 out of 10 have been incarcerated in their life, and myself becoming a victim of gun violence in 2009 is what shaped my worldview and what kind of led me to focus primarily on juvenile justice. Is during graduate school, I was a case manager at the Connecticut Juvenile Training School, and so seeing how the system was run inside, and me myself being a victim of gun violence, I wanted to be vocal to make sure that youth, primarily young men of color, get access to the services and resources that they need.
Thank you. Lindsay, okay, I need everybody to stand up for just a second. Do we perhaps have a former quarterback in the audience? Anybody who played football? Anybody who wants to play football? Oh, we've got one over here. Lindsay, run it over there. Your job is going to throw the mic across the room. And this is how we use a throw mic. Okay, who's the receiver over here? Really? Nobody? Come on. One person. Pick one then. Okay, throw it across to somebody else. Or just pass it across the room so we can get it across the room. Okay, pass it across. Keep going until we get to the other side.
Oh, somebody do a long bomb.
There you go. Careful there. Whoa! Okay, can somebody go grab that? Okay, so we can also run the mic. So I'm going to ask the questions from the podium, and Lindsay, why don't I give you a mic here? In case, so we'll have the throw mic and we'll have the regular mic. Okay. So that was our audience participation, but I wanted to get the juices flowing this morning. So this question is going to be for Aswad and Ann. What are your thoughts about the fact that youth incarceration is down significantly, at the same time juvenile crime is at record lows?
Can I do a quick Mai shout out and ask a question, one more audience participation? How many folks here don't do a lot of work in the juvenile justice system, or you work primarily in the criminal justice system? Can you raise your hands? Okay. And you might be wondering how this all applies to you. I just want to give them a little foundation that if you're dealing with folks in the criminal justice system, one of the biggest pathways there is the juvenile justice system. And I learned that 30 years ago. So if you're thinking this isn't real relevant to you, I hope I'm making a case, and the panel will today. It's super relevant to you, both working with folks who are involved in the juvenile and criminal justice system, but also the survivors who are also involved. I'm not surprised at all because like I said, I've done work in juvenile justice reinvestment for over 10 years with the Pew Public Safety Performance Project. And I know y'all hear the word evidence-based and your eyes might roll back. There's a strong evidence base for everything that we're talking about here. We go into a state and we look at who's detained, and we look at, for me, it's also looking at sort of the conditions that these kids are in. We also talk a lot to survivors and to victim advocates. And I want to just touch briefly on, like I said, I've worked in a number of states, but in Kansas, we're seeing some remarkable success in terms of the juvenile justice reinvestment. And I don't like to read numbers, but I'm going to bore you with a couple. Over the last couple of years, we've seen a 13% reduction in the number of youth who present to juvenile intake and assessment, and a 10% reduction in children in need of care. And I say that to you because that's a really significant decrease, but what we're seeing also an increase in is functional family therapy. Youth advocates in the community who are working with these kids instead of throwing them into factories of failure, as you said, Patrick. And we're seeing a big emphasis, because we heard from survivors and advocates, on restorative justice. So for me to say that I'm surprised that crime and detention are going down, it doesn't surprise me at all, because it's a super smart approach to the way that we all deal with the juvenile justice system.
Thank you, Ann.
Yep,
Thank you, Ann.
And for me, oh, sorry.
Go ahead.
So for me, through, even though youth incarceration is down, the ethnic and racial disparities are increasing, right? And so through my work with Crime Survivors for Safety and Justice and speaking and talking to victims on a daily basis, one is that majority of crime victims that we work with aren't getting access to the services and resources that they need to heal. And there's a consistent theme that there aren't enough resources and services available for young people of color in communities. And so despite youth incarceration is down, we have to do a better job at investing in those organizations who are often at the grassroots level to make sure that they have the resources and services they need to provide services to these youth that are being diverted from the juvenile justice system. And so it's a huge opportunity, which is why this report and this partnership and that roundtable that we had last year is so important, to really help develop strategies and policies to make sure that we are focusing on youth before they come in contact with the juvenile justice system, right? Before they come in contact with the criminal justice system. And we do that by investing in strategies and passing policies that really focus on what safety means to us, what safety means to the community is more jobs, more education, more rehabilitation, more services rather than incarceration.
I want to say to folks out there, anybody who's got a question, just raise your hand and we'll either run you a mic or throw you a mic depending on what you feel more comfortable with. So just interrupt me at any time. For all the panelists that have dealt with young people, so a lot of times, it's an election year and people will campaign on longer sentences for people who have committed crimes. What do we think about longer sentences and creating safer communities? And anyone from the panel can take that.
Well, I'm happy to start off and just, does it work? That's what we should be asking. Right? It may sound tough, may sound good in a commercial, although I would suggest people aren't buying that anymore. And the research is incontrovertible on this, on both the youth side and the adult side, that longer sentences do nothing to make it less likely that someone will commit a crime. In fact, it's the opposite, right? What we've seen in state after state, Virginia being the most recent, is the longer a young person stayed confined, the more likely it was that they would commit an offense after coming out, right? So if we just look at that, right, we would change the way we're doing this. And then just to highlight something that Aswad was talking about, what's in the report, right? this does not play out in a fair way, right? So young people of color get longer sentences for the same types of behavior, right? This is absolutely a fairness and a racial justice issue. And the reality is that if the disproportionate number of kids who are in facilities look like my kids, we wouldn't be having this conversation. We just wouldn't. When we talk about the decline in youth incarceration over the last 10 to 12 years of about a 50% decline, that's really significant. But as Aswad said, during that time, the racial disparities actually got worse, right? So many more white kids were being released, while the black kids, actually the numbers started to go up a little bit, right? So it's not fair and it doesn't work. And we have to hold, just when we talk about holding kids accountable, let's hold decision makers accountable to follow the research.
I just want to say, hey, don't you shut up. I want to say in election year, you hear a lot of folks who, November 6th is a big day for them. They start talking about what victims want. I always run away from people like that as fast as I can because I don't buy that narrative. I think anyone who proposes that they know what victims want is just wrong. And I think a big part of, as we look at juvenile justice reform, is to actually ask victims. I mean, that's what I loved about your roundtables, that survivors were there to really give us their personal experiences. And I think the other thing is we're looking at these significant reforms is that you got to have buy-in from the top leadership, everyone in the state who has an interest in this, including survivors. And of course, I'm bragging on Kansas today, but the leader of the effort in Kansas to do juvenile justice reform, known as a state senator, but he was also, his name is Greg Smith, his daughter Kelsey was murdered. And so a survivor led the effort in a conservative state to do significant reforms. And I think listening to victims as we go through this process is just an important part of everything that we're talking about today.
When I became a victim of gun violence in 2009, the first day of trial, I was, planning to testify against the young man who was 19 years old at the time, who was responsible for my shooting. And I remember sitting in the prosecutor's office and asking him questions about this young man. He was from my community. He looked just like me. They began to tell me that he could barely read or write. They told me that he had already came in contact with the criminal justice system. For some reason, I just started to feel bad for him, right? Because I knew that in a few minutes I was going to go upstairs and testify, and he was going to be sentenced to at least 40 years in jail. But then I started thinking about my family. I started thinking about my oldest brother, who's serving a life sentence in federal prison without the possibility of parole, and the impact that has had on my family. And I didn't want to put that young man and his family through the same thing. And so I asked the prosecutor, can I talk to this young man? And he said, no, we don't do that here. And so I said, is there a plea deal that you guys can offer him? And they said, we've offered him several plea deals. He denied each one. So I sat there and thought about what type of treatment he's going to get for the next 40 years. And then I said, before I go upstairs, can you just go back and offer him one more plea deal this last time? A few minutes later, they came back and said he accepted it. And for me, right there, it seems like all the emotions, all the nervousness, all the anger that I had was released. Because I knew that it was an opportunity for him to be healed, over the next few years. But in fact, I thought about what if we spent, the $500,000 that we were going to spend to incarcerate him for the next 10 years. What if we spent those funding resources on an individualized case management community intervention program for him? There would have been a huge impact on his life, on my life, and the lives of our community if there were investments that focused on his treatment first to help stop the cycles of crime.
I think we had it. Thank you, Aswad.
Good morning. My name is Candace Sims, and I'm with CVAC of Atlanta, Georgia. And first of all, I want to say that I do appreciate all of the conversation today about grassroots organizations and how community is a stakeholder at helping a lot of the victimization and with youth, and as far as it pertains to youth. And I think that that is very, very helpful to just recidivating a lot of our youth. Well, my question is, there's a huge factor of fear in the community and even wanting to approach a youth, to even want to get involved with trying to help be a solution to the problem. So my question is, what do you propose, or how do you address the fear that people have in wanting to even play a role or play a part in wanting to help in the community?
Great question.
I can start. First, we have to get rid of that fear. Many times that I see in communities that I work in, that there are always, whether it's at the policy table, whether it's a community organization developing their programs, they're not often youth at the table. So one, the youth want to feel included in this work, in the community-based programs, and I say you just need those individuals who are willing to go out in the field and talk to youth. Many youth across the country, they just want somebody to care. And if they feel that you care, they feel that you are going to invest in their lives, they will be more willing to walk through your door. But if they don't care, they won't walk through your door, to that community program that you're providing, because it has to start with healing, it has to start with love, it has to start with compassion. When I was a young man, there weren't many community programs in my community, but there was a basketball coach that cared. There was a school teacher that cared enough about what I was going through in my household, what was happening in the community, and that relationship continued to this day because there's school, jobs, or giving back to my community.
Hey, Mike, can I just real quick on that?
Sure.
It's about relationships. It's about getting to know each other, right? A number of years ago, in a part of D.C., they were suffering a lot of violence, right? This was in the Trinidad neighborhood. And one of our staff came to us, it was actually our maintenance worker, and said, I'd like to do something. My church is in that community. Can we help with cutting grass for seniors? The seniors were literally afraid to come out of their homes, right? And so we said, all right, let's figure out how to do it. And he actually said, I want to take some of the young people with me from the facility, right? So we had 3 of our young people who was part of his work group. And they went out and they started working with the seniors. And I'll never forget, with one particular senior, the oldest living woman in D.C. at the time. She was 106 years old, right? And we had 3 young people who had been involved in serious crime in that community. And they were out there getting to know her, giving back. What do you think she called those young people? Anybody can guess? Her babies, right? After just a couple of times, that interaction, that relationship, and those young people, they behaved so well, and they felt good, and they felt connected, right? If we had kept them in the facility and didn't have that interaction, that relationship, we wouldn't have been doing what we should be doing.
Okay. I'm just going to be very, very quick. Georgia was the first state, by the way, that Pew went in to do juvenile justice reform, so I really appreciate that question. I think it's important to validate fear and recognize that fear is actual because you yourself have been harmed or know someone who's been harmed, and a lot of it is perceived. And for me, it's important that we recognize that individuals and communities are frightened, maybe because of the media, maybe because of where they live. But part of it is what you were saying is to bring survivors and to bring the youth into the communities to assuage their fear. I think it's a really big part of what we're talking about. But we have to validate that people are afraid. There's no question about it.
Patrick, and then we've got a question in the audience.
Sure, I just wanted to make the point that as critical as it is to engage folks who live in communities to be part of figuring out how we move forward, there's a way in which we can't let everybody else off the hook. The communities that we're talking about have often been disinvested in. We haven't provided the educational resources. We haven't provided the opportunity for jobs. We haven't provided a path to a better future for folks in those communities. When we talk about communities stepping up, I just think it's wrong to say folks who are struggling to make it day to day, now it's on you to figure this out. It's actually on the rest of us to figure out how we develop stronger communities.
You had a question? Oh, okay.
Okay. Hi, I'm Stacy Phillips, and I'm with the Department